Today is April 5th in the year 2013. I'm Karen Herman, Director of the Archive of American Television, and it is my great pleasure today to be interviewing Greg Daniels, sitting right next to me, here on the last day of the Office set being up in Van Nuys, California.
Thanks, Karen.
Okay, Greg, thanks so much for sitting down with us today.
My
and we are
pleasure.
going to start right from the beginning. What was your name at birth?
Well, same name as I have now. If you ask me my social security number, I'm not telling you.
Any middle name?
Yeah, Martin. Gregory Martin.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in New York City, 1963, and which makes me right now just about to age out of the 18 to 49 demo, which is a little nervous-making. But yep, that was it. I was born in New York. I have one brother and mom and dad. And what do you ask me more questions?
I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. Okay, so tell me a little about your parents, their names, and what they do.
Oh, okay. We're really going into it. Yeah. Well, my dad's name is Aaron, and he's a very funny kind of storyteller, and I think I get a lot of whatever I bring to this business from him. Kind of a frustrated comedian. He was a broadcast executive for Capital Cities, and they had a management meeting every year that he performed in. He had an act similar to Karnak called Aranak. And so some of my earliest joke writing was for his act. He had a turban, and he'd open up envelopes. And I think I had a joke for him, something like he would open up the envelope and he'd say, the PLO, the IRA, and the Mafia. And then, he'd get the answer out, and it would be, name 3 organizations with better health plans than Capital Cities. So that was one of my very early jokes, and I put it in an Office episode, very similar kind of a deal where Michael Scott has a turban on, and he's preparing for the Dundies. I think I put that joke in.
So was your dad involved in television?
No, radio. He was involved in radio.
Did you ever go with him to work, and were you interested in radio itself?
Well, I did have a summer job at a radio station with his friend that he worked as a salesman at, and his friend was the sales manager, and I got a job in radio ad sales one summer in Paterson, New Jersey. And it was for a public affairs program. They were trying to sell some ad time for this local public affairs program that aired like Sunday nights at 3 in the morning. So it was just, he didn't expect me to sell any ads at all, and I managed to kind of finagle a furniture store and another store to buy ads. And it was kind of fun.
Did you like it?
Yeah, it was pretty good. I had grown up hearing stories about my dad doing it, because sort of Tin Man-like stories of him, him and this guy that I was working for as a sales team, and they would go, try and sell radio ads, which are very intangible products. And so there's a lot of kind of blarney involved with selling them. You have to really persuade somebody that it's going to, be worth the money. And so I'd heard a lot of stories about that, and I wanted to try it.
Did it ever help you later on when you were pitching things?
I don't think I'm a very good pitcher. You'll see as this thing goes forward that there's a lot of inarticulateness and halting, sort of lack of screen presence, which is also, unfortunately, how I pitch. But I think it is kind of I always think of my dad as being like Zelig, kind of, because he can kind of find out who he's talking to and immediately turn into that person, which is a salesman's technique, I think.
Talk a little bit about your mother.
Who? I do have a mom. My mom's name is Judy. She worked for the New York Public Library for the most part when I was. That was her largest job when I was growing up. Very nice lady.
Pick up any traits from her?
I'm sorry, Mom. Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure a lot of traits. I'm trying to think of some aspects of her. She's a very strong-willed person, and very active, and was always, when I was a teenager, was always trying to get me to, be more engaged. And like when I was a kid, she wanted me to go stop reading and go out and play. When I was a teenager, she wanted me to admit that life had meaning when I would say, I don't get it. It doesn't seem like there's any meaning here. We're all going to be gone in 100 years. And that always really bothered her. She was, yeah, so a very good mom, though. And then there's some literary stuff on her side of the family. Her mom, my grandmother, loved to, she was sort of like a lyricist. She was like an amateur lyricist. And for every family occasion, there was like a tradition in my family of presenting a comic poem in the honor of people's birthdays or something like that. And my grandmother was like the master of that. And so that was something that I did when I was a kid, that my grandmother would encourage me to stand up and deliver these kind of rhyming toasts. And then her younger brother was a novelist. So I had heard, growing up, I was always like, oh my gosh, Uncle Jim has books, and, you can go to the library and look up Uncle Jim's books and stuff like that. And so, I guess it was a little bit, there was an awareness that writing was something cool.
Did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Well, the people would say to me two things. Well, they would say, you should be a lawyer. And they usually said that when I was being really argumentative and stubborn, and, it was not said with love. And then, kids in my class thought I was funny, and, and I liked writing. So the other idea was to be a writer. And when I graduated from college, I was, I had both those sort of thoughts, and I felt like I should try writing, just because the fact that people, when they said lawyer, it was not, they were playing into probably the more unlikable parts of my personality. So I thought I'd try something, something that people would approve of more.
Did you watch a lot of television growing up?
I did watch television. There was a couple things, it was harder to watch television then because you just watched whatever was on. And New York City had a lot more channels than most places. So we had syndication, and like a very big thing for me when I was a kid was watching I Love Lucy in syndication, and it was always around the same time as dinner. And so I just remember, being like around the middle of a I Love Lucy episode, and my mom saying dinner was ready, and just like, oh God, I want to finish the episode, and always delaying and everything. And I love The Odd Couple. And but probably the most significant TV show for me was Monty Python, which hit when I was about 12. It was on Channel 13 in New York. And for people my age who were interested in comedy, this was like, it was amazing. I mean, it was like we knew all the routines. It was like a cliche that you'd be this Monty Python nerd that would show up at school the next day, and you'd start doing it in the voices of, I'm here to buy a budgie, or, whatever it was. And you'd do all the entire routines out and everything. And, when we traded anything that they put out, like they had comedy books and albums and stuff, and everything was saturated in comedy that they did. It was like the liner notes of the album were like a parody of liner notes, and they didn't have anything that they didn't pump creativity into. And so that was like probably the biggest influence. And then I loved to, I was a big reader. and I read a lot of different genres. I read a lot of mystery and science fiction, but there aren't a lot of humor books. At least there aren't a lot of classic humor books that were available. So I kind of read everything I could that was humor related. I liked Bruce J. Friedman, Woody Allen. I liked S.J. Perelman, which is, now when I look back on it, it's like so kind of twee. It's like I'm a little embarrassed, but I read it when I was a kid. And, Groucho Marx had stuff that you could read. And, and then there was like Mark Twain and Ambrose Bierce. And if you went to the bookstore or a used bookstore and looked up like humor collections, you'd often get these books from the 1800s of like contemporaries of Mark Twain that were writing stories in enormous dialect stories, and I kind of poked my way through those, and George S. Kaufman, so I find these old paperbacks, and they'd be very attractive because it would say like best humor writing, and then a lot of times it'd be pretty outdated stuff, but I'd read it anyway.
When did you first try your hand at humor writing?
Well, the school that I went to was very cool about writing. There was like a lot of the teachers, I feel like, probably came to New York to be playwrights or something like that, and then ended up as teachers. They were very colorful people, and they were very much supportive of writing. And we had a little literary magazine, which I was the editor of. And I remember, like in second grade, this is, obviously this is really this is a 3-hour interview, so you're getting, more detail than you want. But I did write a little story about a raccoon, and I included in the story when he went to the bathroom, because I remember thinking, it's not in any of the books. This is a human thing that everyone does, and you can't find it in any of these stories that I'm reading. Harold and the Purple Crayon, he doesn't go to the bathroom. So I had a whole thing about him going to the bathroom, which, was like the first of a long series of bathroom-related humor, I guess, for me.
How'd it go over in your demo?
Very, very well. I had the second grade sensibility down. And then I guess, when I was in high school, I worked on the school newspaper, and there was a calendar section in the school newspaper, which just was upcoming events. And I used to fill it with jokes. And so I got a lot of nice feedback from people who liked these jokes that I would put in the calendar section. And sometimes I would get in trouble for them. And I remember one time this guy, I think he was the captain of the football team. He was on the football team. I had made some slighting reference to the football team in my calendar thing. And I remember him physically picking me up and kind of shaking me. And then a friend of mine wrote me like an anonymous threatening letter, which I assumed was from the football team because he had, I guess. So there was also a time when I was more worried about getting beat up for what I was doing that was unjustified because my friend was playing a trick on me. But
what high school did you go to?
Well, I went to boarding school. I went to Exeter in New Hampshire, which is sleepaway school from 10th grade through the end of high school. And, it had a lot of facilities. It's a great school. And there was a lot of, great English teachers. And they taught me a lot of good stuff, good writing. And I got a chance to interview, on the newspaper, I got a chance to interview different writers, like John Irving went to that school. And he came through when I was there, and I got a chance to interview him, and that was kind of exciting.
And where'd you go to college?
Well, then I went to Harvard from there, and also worked in the newspaper, and also got a chance to interview people. I interviewed Norman Lear, which was pretty great, like around 1984.
You're a big fan of his?
Yeah, huge fan of All in the Family. And he was a great He gave a very stirring kind of a lecture, and I really wanted to meet him, so somehow I wangled the assignment to interview him.
Did you ever get to meet him again later? Once you were in business?
Not in any setting where I could talk about that. I think I ran into him first really briefly at a very big TV Academy kind of a lobby type event, and I was considering should I, but it wasn't really the right setting. There was a lot of people around. But yeah, I'd love to talk to him. Yeah, I'd like to talk to him about the British original that All in the Family was based on, because I had some later experience in adapting a British show, and so it seemed like we had a lot of, there's a lot I could talk to him about.
What did you major in at Harvard?
Well, at Harvard, I started off as a literature major, which was, part of my kind of desire to be a writer. But the literature department was filled with critical theory, and there wasn't a lot about how to actually write, or about the lives of writers, or about what you do to achieve an effect with an audience, or anything practical. It was all the prevailing theory was that the author wasn't very important, and the text was available for any interpretation by a critic. And there was this guy, Roland Barthes, who was the theorist, that was in vogue then. And I struggled with that for sophomore year, trying to learn about him, until I learned in his biography that he had been run over by a laundry truck while forgetting to look both ways when he crossed the street in France. And when that happened, I made this decision that I didn't want to spend a lot of time reading him. I mean, he may have been fascinating intellectual, but I was like, all right, I'm sorry, but you were run over by a laundry truck, so there's a limit to how much you can teach me, I think, since you don't know how to look both ways when you cross the street. So I switched into another major called History and Literature, which was more like old-fashioned stuff, where when they studied the literature, it was more in the context of the historical time, and wasn't all theory. And I didn't. It was mostly because I liked history, I liked literature. There was a lot of. I was able to take a lot of courses inside the major, so I did that. And I applied to law school just as when I graduated. And when I moved to LA, I had a deferred acceptance for NYU Law School in my pocket, and I kept, I was always feeling like, at least I got that. If this doesn't work out, and I kept trying to defer until eventually they said, you've been deferring for 5 years. You obviously aren't coming. And then I forget how that worked, but for a while I had that as a backup. And my mom really wanted me to be an entertainment lawyer, because she was like, well, you like all the writing, that's the entertainment part, and you're kind of interested in law, why don't you become an entertainment lawyer? Which isn't to me, wasn't the best of both worlds. It was, although my lawyer now has a fascinating life and is, completely on top of his game. So actually it would be kind of cool, but there's no writing and production and anything in it.
So at what point, so you're in college, were you writing any humor? Were you involved in it?
So my best friend growing up, his sister had gone to Harvard, and she had said there's this sort of magical place at Harvard called the Harvard Lampoon, which is this humor magazine. And before, when I was in high school, she was like, you ought to go there if you can and try and work there, because that's a place for people who want to write comedy. And so when I did go to college, I was on the newspaper, and I didn't try to write for the humor magazine until close to the end, junior year, I guess. But I did start writing for the humor magazine junior year, and I met a lot of fun people, one of whom, Conan O'Brien, and he and I decided to try to become comedy writers after college. So we became a team and wrote spec material. And the thing is, you never know growing up that there is a job. Like, I didn't know watching The Odd Couple that anybody wrote it. I just assumed that they were talking it, and you're not really told that there is a possible job of writing TV shows. At least I didn't ever hear about it. But I had heard that people who had been on the Lampoon had, some of them had tried to be professional writers, and the year right before we graduated, two guys who we knew had come to L.A. and were working on a TV show for cable called Not Necessarily the News. And so we had heard that this was like a possible job. And, it was kind of on the outskirts. Like, sounds great to be working for HBO now, but HBO at the time was not the same thing. They had a show called First and 10, which was a comedy about football, and it was just gratuitous nudity because it was on cable, and it was really like a lower level of the entertainment industry. And you weren't eligible for Emmys. There was a special ACE award for cable. Anyway, so they paid a lot less, and we were a team. So we sent all this information in, and all of the spec material. We spent some time writing sketches, and then we were like, okay, we're ready to go to Hollywood, and we didn't hear back anything. And after a while, my mom was like, you guys you're not going to get this job. You got to go make some money. Why don't you go apply to a temp agency? So we went and took typing tests and we got all ready. And then, miraculously, we got a letter saying, we'll try you out for 3 weeks in Los Angeles. And it was pretty low risk proposition for the guys who were hiring us, because it's only 3 weeks, and we were splitting one junior most salary. But it was amazing, and obviously this was our big break, and we came out. Conan and I came out and stayed in Oakwood and worked at Not Necessarily the News, and then we kept getting 3-week extensions to our contract. So I forget how many, maybe 6. We had like about 6 3-week extensions, and every 3 weeks they go, yeah, you're doing okay. We'll put you on for another 3 weeks, and then gradually, we worked there for about a year and a half, maybe more, maybe 2 years, all in. I think the biggest extension we got was a 9-week extension, and then we were like, yes, and we bought a car.
Talk a little about the show itself, Not Necessarily the News. What exactly was it?
Well, it was a British remake. It was a remake from a British show called Not the 9 O'Clock News, and it was on HBO, and it was produced by Moffat Lee Productions, Pat Lee and John Moffat, and those were our bosses. Pat Lee was the guy, gave us our big break, and John Moffat was the director. And it was basically like blackout sketches mixed with this very cool thing that they did where they would get news footage from the Sherman Grimberg agency, which supplied ABC News with all their news footage. And we would get unedited news footage and pour over it and try to think of jokes involving the news footage that we could then shoot little insert shots or put voiceover on and make it look as if the people in the news were, participating in our sketches. So like a famous one was Kissinger sitting next to Nixon, I guess, on a plane, and he's looking, and Nixon's got a sandwich in front of him, and then somebody imitated Kissinger's voice going, oh, that's how you're going to eat that, or, his stuff. And there was like another thing where the Ayatollah Khomeini was giving a big speech, and, a sea of people in burqas, and they're throwing prayers, maybe, something like that, to his feet, and, and the guys at the show had cut in that they were throwing like hotel room keys and stuff, and there's an insert shot of his feet with just some hotel keys landing on it. So that all happened before we were there. But that was the show, and so we did just sketch ideas, like little movie parodies and
Are
stuff.
there any that you just love that you?
Well, I still think about some of them because there was a real division on that show between the actors and the writers. Like, you never talked to the actors, and you weren't really allowed on the set. You just kind of stayed in the writing room and came up with tons of sketch ideas. And it was frustrating because, I remember one thing that I wrote. It's hard to imagine that it was funny now, but it was some kind of, the essence of it was, it looked like an ad for the Navy, but then it turned out to be an ad for Top Gun, the movie, or something like that. And the very first shot in the set decoration, there's a guy in front of a locker, and the locker says, Goose and whatever Tom Cruise's character's name was in Top Gun. So from the first frame, you know it's a Top Gun parody. And the whole point of the sketch was that it was a reveal that it's a Top Gun parody. And because, as a writer, I wasn't on the set, to say, hey, the whole point of this is that we're hiding that piece of information, So there was a lot of frustrations like that, because that sketch was blown by the fact that the information that was supposed to be a big reveal was present in the first frame because of the set decoration. And so, I think about that sometimes as, just like the necessity to hide information is a big part of comedy. And that was the first time I really learned that lesson. So whenever I run into a situation where I'm like, oh, well, here's the problem. The problem is that you can deduce from the visuals, the information that we're supposed to be hiding. I always go, oh, that's that Top Gun situation. So that's the way my brain's organized. I have like 1,000 rules that are derived from something that happened to me, some sketch or joke that was blown or succeeded, especially in like those early years when I was doing variety. So
in terms of, this is your foot in the door in television, what did you think of the whole experience? Was it surprising to you?
Well, it was weird, I mean, I didn't know anybody else who had done it, aside from these two guys who were a year ahead of us. David Sachs and Rob Lazebnik are their names. And, and we worked in the Gower Studios, which has a view of the Hollywood sign. So that was kind of epic. And every day we would, we would go to Denny's for lunch in Gower Gulch. And, and then we would work writing sketches on IBM Selectric typewriters because they didn't have computers. And, so it was kind of like a classic sketch comedy thing. And the other writers that we worked with, there was sort of a generational divide. Like there were the head writer and the kind of senior writers were guys in their 40s who had kind of come up through counterculture kind of stuff. Like one of them was in Kentucky Fried Movie. Do you know that? Do you remember that movie? Kentucky Fried? It was sort of like a sketch comedy movie from the 70s. He was a performer in it, in the sense that there was some sketch that involved his genitals being like with a hat on it or something. I don't know. Anyway, so that was his claim to fame, and and they'd all written like kind of cool 1970s-ish sketch stuff. And every afternoon they would go into their offices and the faint smell of pot smoke would come out, and and it was kind of generationally different because they were really still angry about Richard Nixon, and and we were like these kind of fresh off the boat 1980s kind of yuppie comedy writers who were not doing any drugs, and we're just really trying to succeed in Hollywood, and write as many stuff as we could. And we kind of didn't think it was cool to be hammering Richard Nixon still in the 80s, since he was, but it was obviously so formative for that generation that, And when I was out here, actually, there was another guy named Greg Daniels who who I just started talking to his mom randomly because I worked on some special, and I got to my desk and opened up a drawer, and there was a menu in there, and I called the restaurant, and she said, "What's your name?" We got to talking. I said, "Greg Daniels." She said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. My son is a writer named Greg Daniels," and he was pushing a script about Richard Nixon, comedy script, and I started to get worried that this script would land on everybody's desks, but he eventually, I think, left the business because I haven't heard from him. Whatever, we can edit that out. It's not very important. My anxieties for being misidentified.
And then you moved on to the Wilton North Report.
Yeah. So all right. So what happened was, we worked for not necessarily the news, and then you'd work for like a month and a half in 3-week increments on that show, and then they'd kind of furlough you because they only had like 12 episodes a year. And in the off time, I was a paralegal, and Conan worked at Wilson's House of Suede and Leather, and we tried to do different things in the off time. And so eventually they just let us go, and we were looking around for another job, and we heard about, I think maybe one of the guys from Not the News, Matt Newman, I think, may have been the head writer for Wilton North Report. Anyway, we heard about the Wilton North Report, which was this new Fox late night show that was starting, and it sounded really cool, and it was from the producer of SCTV and Letterman. And, so we both were super excited because we loved SCTV and Letterman. And so we signed on, Conan and I signed on to do this show. We later found out it was the line producer of SCTV and Letterman, which was sort of an important distinction. And I guess he didn't like the fact that Letterman was a very strong performer, and so he assembled all these kind of cool writers, but then when it came time to find the performers, any really strong performer was threatening to this producer. So, like, we could have had Ellen DeGeneres. I remember she was auditioning, and we were all like, "She's really funny," and she hadn't achieved any kind of stardom yet. But he ended up going with these 2 radio DJs from like Portland or something, and the show was like in a way it was wonderful because it fell apart. It was like a 6-month pre-production, and then it fell apart in probably 2 months when it was on the air. And while it was falling apart, they tried everything, and they were like, "All right, well, the hosts aren't great. What if the writers are on camera?" So there was a brief moment where we would do on-camera stuff, and then they were like, "Well, that's not going to fix it. How about the segment producers?" And and so the whole you learn so much more from an experience that completely explodes, and you get to see everything that happens that can go wrong. So I thought it was really kind of fun, and we learned a lot. But the whole thing was over in under a year.
Okay. Let's stop for a second. Okay, yeah, we're back on.
Okay.
Okay, and talk a little bit about you actually appeared on camera
for the Wilton North
time.
Report.
Yeah.
Now, that's interesting that you know that. I have been trying to bury that, but yeah, no, I did. Nell Scoville helped. I forget whether she wrote it or I wrote it, but at some point I was sent to interview a supermodel, Carole Bouquet, who was also a Bond girl, and she was the voice and face of Chanel. And she was in town, and I guess doing all these interviews, and wasn't aware that this was sort of a comedy show. And I was sent to interview her, and my idea, the bit was that I was like tongue-tied in the presence of this, international beauty, and tried to get her to kiss me on camera, which I did, which was, probably an early form of sexual harassment. And, and it was super awkward. And, she didn't know what was going on. And all the comedy writers loved Andy Kaufman and, and his ability to kind of take something which had rules and was like a social interaction with rules and start to bend or break the rules in a way where nobody knew what was going on. And so she was very didn't know if I was for real or whatever. And anyway, it was awkward but kind of funny. It was well reviewed when we actually aired. The TV critic for LA Times liked it. I got a little mention, but that was kind of the end of my acting career. Reminds me actually of, we were talking about comedy books. Terry Southern wrote a book called The Magic Christian, which was a very funny comedy book that I loved also. And the whole point of this guy, this character, was that he was a eccentric millionaire who had a budget to freak people out, kind of, and so he would. It's a funny book. You should read it. It's a very 1970s book. But. So I used to do some of that kind of stuff. Like I don't know, in my life. Like for example, I remember at one point I was at an ATM machine in New York in the 80s, and it was really cold, and I was in there, inside like this room, and there was somebody on the street who was trying to get me to open the door for him, and he was gesturing, open the door, and I was trying to see how long I could prolong the moment of not knowing what he meant. Do you know what I mean? For comedy, no, there's nobody watching this, but so he kept saying, "Go to the door," and I was like, "What? Call? Do what?" And so I don't know. I try and amuse myself like that. That sounds like kind of jerky behavior now, but anyway, that was what that thing was like with Carole Bouquet.
Did you have any more aspirations to do anything else on camera? Or?
I don't know. I'm way too introverted and self-conscious to do anything on camera. On The Office, I did one little bit, and there was a big crossover of writers into performers on The Office, which was mostly because I think I loved Monty Python so much, and they were all writer-performers, and I felt like what was wrong with TV was too much of a distinction between writers and performers, going back to not necessarily the news when we never talked to the performers. So I really felt like it was important that the writers and performers all would hang out and that there was crossover. So at one point, I was playing Michael's neighbor when he first moves into his condo, and I had to improvise with Steve and Rain. And, so I had my line, and I sweatily over-prepared it. And then, Steve was just sort of playing around because he's like master improviser, and said, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And I froze, and I was like, "I'm a yarn salesman," and anyway, I couldn't stand looking at myself in the editing room, and so I cut myself out. And, I don't think you have a lot of objectivity when you're looking at yourself. At least I didn't. So.
Once Wilton North disappeared, what was your next stop?
Right. So Wilton North disappeared, and Conan and I had our agent was Howard Klein, who I've been with for like 28 years now, and is the EP on everything I do as a manager now. And at that time, he decided to become a manager, and we had a year previously, had written spec material while we were at not necessarily the news for Saturday Night Live. And when Howard became a manager, he became a manager at Brillstein, who represented Lorne and all the guys at SNL. And so this is like our second big break, was he was able to get our packet of material to the head writer of Saturday Night Live, Jim Downey, and he liked our material and brought us in for a 2-week trial period. Which was probably in 1987. And so we went to New York for 2 weeks, wrote on SNL for 2 weeks, and then pretty soon after that was shut down by a writer's strike. So maybe that was 88. I don't remember when that writer's strike was. But right before we had been shut down, we had been hired on SNL. So maybe we got another week or two in. Obviously, the 2-week trial period had worked out. and this was, you know, a huge break because this was really high quality network comedy, and it was a great cast. It was like Dana Carvey and Phil Hartman and John Lovitz and, you know, all those guys. And so we joined the writing staff there. And at this point, Conan and I weren't a team anymore, although we had written our spec material from the year previous as a team. So we ended up being hired as two individuals. And although we wrote together a lot on Saturday Night Live, and we also wrote with Robert Smigel and Bob Odenkirk, who were two guys our age who, you know, were also on at the same time. So a lot of times we would clump together, the four of us, to write things. And SNL is a very interesting environment because you're all on the same writing staff, but you're not working on the same material. And an hour and a half before the show airs, Lorne cuts a third of the material. So it had a little bit of a competitive vibe to it at that time, where, you know, you and your guys had a sensibility and had a sketch, and you were competing against, you know, like Al Franken's sketch, although he was often in the room with Lorne making the decisions. So it was a super interesting time. I mean, you know, classic TV show, amazing treat to be able to watch Lorne produce it and to participate in a live comedy show. And the cast was crazy talented, and the other writers were, you know, so we really had to like step up our game when we got to that show.
Okay. Talk a little bit about, I know you said that you guys were separate for Saturday Night Live, but talk about your work together as a comedy writing team, what that was like and how you split the duties on that.
Well, it was, you know, it was really fun. We were just starting out. We had, you know, different styles. I'm like slower, more thoughtful, more story-oriented probably. Conan's more of a performer. When we both lived out here, he was doing Groundlings. He was taking, you know, doing improv classes, and when we weren't working, and I was like lying in my apartment listening to the radio and, you know, being introverted. And so, like, he would say to me, he had a thing he used to say about me. He would say, when you overthink, you start to stink. And he would say that all the time to try and get me to, like, not overthink stuff. But, you know, we had a lot of fun, and we would, you know, I would play little tricks on him. Like he, wherever I would always tell people it was his birthday, no matter where we were eating lunch, because they would, you know, I would convince people that it was his birthday so that people would sing to him. And at Johnny Rockets, the hamburger place, he would sing to you if it was your birthday. So I used to do that to him all the time, which also was one of those things where it was like funny the first time and then not funny for about 15 times and then kind of started to get funny again, in a little bit of an Andy Kaufman way maybe. But, you know, it was like such an adventure, and we had worked together on the Lampoon, and, you know, it was just we shared everything. We shared one little car, and we shared our apartment, and we shared an office, not necessarily the news, and our desks faced each other. And, you know, if he had a date, I didn't have any, I either went in the back seat or, you know, stayed home. And it was like, so we went through a lot of, you know, adventures. There was one time where we were like, we got to get out of the city. And we had heard that there was something called the Expo was happening in Vancouver. And we planned this big trip to go to Vancouver to go to the Expo, which I think we had decided was something like the Olympics or something, that it was going to be this amazing stuff. And we got there, and it was like completely corporate. Like it was like, you know, the Kodak company's pavilion on new products, and it was incredibly boring. So we were just wandering around Vancouver, and we watched a little local television, and there was a TV show called The Beachcombers, which was this weird, you know, 20-year-old Canadian television show that was like a protected show in Canada. It couldn't have been imported because it was incredibly boring. And the main character was one of the main characters was a Native American named Pat John, which were the two names of our bosses, Pat Lee and John Moffat. And we said, you know what if we decided to kill Pat John? There'd be no motive. It would, why would just two comedy writers come up from L.A. and think he was, such a weird, bad actor that they would go kill him? So we decided we would track him down because we didn't have anything to do. Our plane left the next day, and we conceived of the plan to track down Pat John, and it morphed into just shaking his hand. We obviously weren't stalking him, but it was really hard to find him. And eventually we had to go to the harbor and persuade a fisherman to take us to this remote island that he was filming on, and we were running out of time, and we were running down the street, yelling for Pat John, and eventually we found him and took a picture shaking his hand. That was all, and then we went back. But we had weird, random adventures.
And why did you two dissolve the writing partnership itself?
Well, there was a moment where the producer of Wilton North Report got on the television feed to the affiliates of Fox to describe the upcoming show, and he went through all the writers, and he was like, we've got Paul Slansky from New York Magazine and Paul Krasner from The Realist, and we've got Nell Scoville from Spy Magazine and Matt Newman from not necessarily the news, and he came to us and he was like, and Krogan, and that and he had forgotten our names and just crushed it into one monster. And I think around that point we were like, this is not, it'd be better to each have our own identity, and he wanted to act and stuff, and I didn't want to act. And anyway, it was very amicable. So, especially since we ended up on the same show, and we ended up writing together plenty anyway. So he stayed at SNL after our contracts were up. But at that point, I was dating my wife, who I met on SNL. And she had moved to Los Angeles to be an executive at ABC in the specials department. And so I left at the end of my contract and moved out to L.A. To be with her and to write longer form stuff.
What did you take from Saturday Night Live? What did you learn?
Oh, I learned a ton. I mean, one of the cool things about it was that the writers produced their own sketches. So there's a lot of producing work. And, so you'd write a sketch, and then you'd have to meet, if the sketch was selected to be mounted, you'd meet with the set decorator, the set designer first, and then the prop guy, and, you'd cast extras if you had to cast them, and, and you had to negotiate all these different people, and you had to learn when to be assertive and, when to let them do their jobs because they were the experts. And I remember part of it was learning how to squelch other people's creativity in the service of one story. And so, for example, the prop guy would always try and make a funny phone. There'd be some sketch where somebody was on the phone, and they would usually suggest, how about a princess phone? That's funny. And you'd have to go, well, the point of this sketch is not about the phone. We're going to have a straight phone. Nothing creative about the phone, And Lorne was very supportive of the writers. And I remember at one point, Conan and I, in our first, couple of producing outings, ran afoul of the costume designer. And she said, you got to fire these people or I'm quitting, to Lorne. And, this was the head of the costume department. And she'd been there for years, and we'd been there for 6 months or something. And Lorne, called us into his office, and we were worried that we were going to get fired. And he basically said, all right, I'm going to keep you in here for 10 minutes because she's upset. but he completely backed his writers, and, and it all kind of, she backed down. But so there's a lot of producing, and then there was a lot of writing because there was great writers there. And a lot of things that I, use now, I learned there from Jim Downey, the head writer, There's one kind of truism that I noticed there that he had brought up, which is that there's kind of like two kinds of stories. There's the normal person in the bizarre situation, which is the story that's favored by writers mostly. And then there's the bizarre person in the normal situation, which is often really favored by the actors. And so, like, you'll see different kinds of sketches on SNL. Like, one kind will be like this crazy character who's just, on a date at a restaurant. And then another one, will be a more normal person who's, been teleported to the Middle Ages or whatever. And so there's always like those type of things. So a lot of times now I'll go, oh, okay, this is one of the reasons why the actor really likes this is because it's that kind of sketch or something, or that kind of game. And he had a lot of good stuff to talk about word choice. If you're a writer, word choice is very important. And, when actors are doing impressions, for example, certain words they can really get a grip on for their impressions. Like if you're doing a Boston accent, that's why you pack your card and have it yad, because you want to get those sounds in. So, if you're writing a guy who's doing a Boston accent, you better put a lot of those kind of words in. And I don't know, there's a lot of different things I learned from there.
What do you think is the legacy of Saturday Night Live?
Well, I mean, God, the legacy of Saturday Night Live is enormous. There's the sensibility, which was like a minority sensibility when it started, and has become, I think, the majority comedy sensibility. And then there's just the people that over the years have come out of there and passed through that as like a training ground. Enormous. If I had stayed another year, I would have met and worked with, Adam Sandler and a lot of great people of that generation. But every 3 or 4 years, there's a different generation of comic actors that come through there. And then they end up being the people you write movie scripts for the next 10 years. So I was, we were so thrilled. And it was such an exciting place to work, too, because of the live aspect and the music. And, and it was in New York. And there are very few jobs where you can be in the entertainment industry in New York compared to L.A. And that's where I'd grown up. So, I was really excited to go back there. Although I never saw any friends because the hours on Saturday Night Live were so weird. Like you'd get there at 2 p.m. and you'd leave at 6 a.m. So I rarely saw anybody I knew. But super exciting. And there was times when one of the things that was the most exciting moments as an anecdote was Conan and I had written a cold open for the show, and it hadn't been picked after the dress rehearsal. They had gone with something else. But then the show started to spread as it was airing, and around 12:30 or something, Lorne realized that he couldn't fit everything into the show, and he decided to put our sketch in instead of something else because it was shorter. So we were like, yeah, awesome. We got very excited. And then we realized that our sketch ended with Live from New York at Saturday Night Live because it was supposed to be the cold open. And we realized this with about 2 minutes to go. So we ran down to the cue cards and wrote a new ending on the sketch directly onto the cue cards, which were, with big magic marker. We came up with an ending. And the musical guest was playing the song, which would lead right into the sketch. So, and it was like a familiar song, and we were like, okay, there's another verse of this song, and then whatever it is going to go on live television. We're working on the ending. So there was moments like that were just, high adrenaline kind of cool show busy moments.
And it came off okay?
Yeah, it came off okay. We got it in just at the last minute.
Any particular guest hosts that you worked with that
were great?
Yeah.
Well, Alec Baldwin, was fantastic. Tom Hanks. Sometimes for writing, it was more fun to have like a weird host, like like if there was an 11-year-old girl or something, because most of the hosts were like 30-year-old comedians, guys. So sometimes it was, if it was like Mary Lou Retton had been the host, that would be very creative, because you'd be like, oh, good, a whole new, area of sketch ideas. And then Mary Tyler Moore was super nice. She offered everybody a ride to the party afterwards. And Tony Danza was really nice. And Dolly Parton. Those were the nicest people, I think, those three. But it was really exciting to be there.
Were most hosts open to what was written for them, and were they collaborative in this?
Yeah. Some of them had bad suggestions. Terrible suggestions the hosts would have. And Lorne was really good about kind of negotiating them. But if you ran into a host that, didn't have a good sense of humor, you'd have to take the sketch and try it next week or something. And then some of them, I know you said that I could, name names and everything, but I don't know. Some of them were terrible. You'd be like, oh my God, how is that person a movie star? And then you realize, oh, okay, it's because somebody stitched together a performance for them. But we had a sketch that was such a heartbreaker. It was called The Perfect Murder. This was a sketch that Conan and I had written, and the idea of it was, and it was really fun to write, and just like when we wrote it, we knew we had something. It was really fun. And the point of the sketch was that there was a professor of criminology, and he had plotted the perfect murder, and he was writing in his diary about it. And as he's writing, like, one of his graduate students just comes in and reads over his shoulder and goes, "Oh, you're planning a murder," and the professor panics and kills the guy and knocks him out or whatever. And then just everything goes wrong. Like somebody else delivers a pizza and sees that he's committed a murder, and starts to go away, and someone else takes a picture with a Polaroid, and the picture flies out the window, and it just goes to crap for him immediately. And so we wrote it for what's that guy from Fish Called Wanda? Kevin Kline. We wrote for Kevin Kline. We thought it would be perfect, and somehow or another it just kind of didn't work. And then we tried it on Matthew Modine. We just kept bringing it out for all these people with this horrible sense of desperation, because the more times you mount the sketch, the less funny it is to all of the crew and everybody. And we never were able to get that sketch going. And we thought we had just the perfect sketch. So I don't know, that was a funny thing that happened. So I moved to LA, and I tried to write screenplays, and I spent a year writing a comedy action screenplay about a 18-year-old undercover cop in a crack house. And right before I went out with it, the movie Rush came out, which was also set in a crack house and was a drama and didn't do very well. And then that was the end of the year that I'd spent working on my screenplay, because nobody bought another crack house movie, even though it was completely different.
Actually, let's stop there and change the